Yeah. Yeah, get him, Ramirez. Oh, hello. Earlier, I had talked about, just briefly, about how you don't need to be a fan of the Dresden Files in order to play this game. You don't need to know anything about it. And while you can kind of create your own world from scratch, it's probably easier to use the established setting, one of the few games where I recommend you do so. Now, if you don't know anything about the Dresden Files, starting on page 10 and going up until page about 14 or so, you'll find information about the world. Unlike some other games that I might mention that have chapters and chapters and chapters on settings, not that I'm going to name any names, the Dresden Files has a measly 5 pages. They tell you everything you need to know specifically to run a good game. So let's go over it so that I don't need to do it later. So the book presents to you a few key facts and ideologies regarding the setting that will help you understand and run the game. The first, monsters have natures. Mortals have the power of choice. The thing that separates a player character from a non-player character in the Dresden Files is the freedom of choice. In the books that you see behind me and in the game, mortals always have the power to choose, whereas monsters or supernatural entities that are not mortals are always bound by their natures. Take fairies, for instance. A fairy cannot lie. They can deceive, they can manipulate the truth, but they cannot tell a blatant falsehood. It's just in their nature. Whereas mortals, as we know from the real world, are fully capable of lying. Case in point, this is a shelf that is entirely full of lemons. A fairy couldn't do that. The second point that they bring up is that things fall apart. Specifically, things are falling apart. By the time your game will take place, the world of the Dresden Files will be less than happy. Basically, in the last few years, monsters have been kind of resurging and becoming braver. Mortals have become darker. So some examples it gives, drug use is spreading, people lose themselves in their searches for pleasure, power, or escape, but it does bring up that there are those who stand against the tide of darkness. Mostly wizards. But I'm not going to talk about wizards. I'm going to power through this and give you kind of the blanket understanding of the world at large. The next point is that science fails. Monsters are not reliably affected by the laws of physics. A bigger gun or a smarter computer is not always the answer to the problem in the Dresden Files. Human magic users, so wizards, have a tendency to kind of screw up post-World War II era technology that they're around. That's why wizards don't use modern guns. They prefer to rely on magic and swords, and in rare cases, like Harry Dresden himself, kind of older model, more reliable firearms. Cars break down. Computers especially are not safe. The newer the technology, and the more powerful the magic user, the more likely that technology is to fail. It's speculated that this has something to do with electromagnetic fields and whatnot, but it's best not to try to explain it at all. All right. The next point that they get to is belief is power. Magic is powered by your belief in that magic. For instance, having faith in say, a religion or a god will repel certain monsters like vampires because faith is power. So the exact details of faith can kind of vary. It brings this up in the books and it brings it up in the role-playing game. But just because someone believes that they can fly doesn't mean that they can fly. It's really weird. But magic as faith ties into my next point. Magic is what you are. You can't make magic do something that goes against your fundamental nature. This works on deliberate and emotional levels. Someone that's very kind and sincere will be unable to perform a very powerful, malicious spell that will cause a lot of harm. Likewise, a vicious and corrupt person that practices human sacrifice isn't going to have healing magic at his command. So, it's kind of very interesting. Not kind of, but very interesting. This means that magic is kind of like you can, in theory, do anything with it, but you have to hit all these kinds of parameters. Now let's talk about some of what exists in the Dresden Files. First, you have mortals. That's you and me. People that cannot use magic, and for the most part are unaware of the supernatural. However, someone who is aware of the supernatural is referred to as clued in. Some examples of clued in people might be some people of faith. An example from the Dresden Files, the novels, might be special detectives or police officers that are aware of it, or someone maybe who has friends in the supernatural community that had no other choice but to be clued in. Next, we have minor talents. These are people who have a very limited supernatural ability. Maybe they can cast 1 or 2 spells, or know a couple of rituals, or they can speak to the dead, that kind of thing. After them, we have sorcerers. They're more powerful magic users. They use like cults or pacts with outside forces like fairies or demons to get more power. Sorcerers and wizards are not only differentiated by being a part of the White Council of Wizards, their governing body, but usually sorcerers are weaker than wizards because sorcerers simply don't have the training or raw power. That brings us to wizards. So wizards often have training and tools and talent, but they are limited in that they need to follow the laws of magic. Nothing is stopping them from breaking them, of course, except for the threat of death by the other wizards. So the first law of magic says that you cannot kill someone directly with magic. Doing so basically guarantees that some other wizard is going to hunt you down and kill you with a sword, because you can't kill someone with magic. The last type of mortal magic user I'd like to talk about are necromancers. So necromancy are people that use death magic, like raising zombies, causing plagues, and necromancers are separated from wizards and sorcerers in that they are inherently lawbreakers. A necromancer is as good as dead if he is caught by the White Council, regardless of his intentions. Okay, so the next group that we have to go over are semi-mortals. People who have a foot in the mortal world and another foot in the supernatural. So these are people like werewolves or scions, which are people that are half mortal, half monster. You might have changelings, half human, half fairy, and people that are halfway turned by vampires. Yeah, so that's nice. All right, then we have the monsters. I brought up werewolves earlier. There are quite a few kinds of those, which I won't get into right now. There are at least 4 courts of vampires, and they all have different kind of powers and what they feed on and whatnot. For instance, the black court of vampires feeds on death, the red court on blood, and the white court on energy. Next are ghouls, which are undead that are very hard to kill. I'm not actually sure if they're undead in the Dresden Files, but what I do know is that they're like cockroaches. They just keep coming back, they survive everything, and they want to eat you. Okay, maybe not cockroaches want to eat you, but you get the gist of it. And then we have the inhabitants of the supernatural world outside of the mortal world. This is called the Never Never. Never, never. The laws of physics there work very differently. It's kind of hard to get to. It's where fairies live. It's where demons live, gods, monsters, dragons, etc. Yeah, so after that, there's not really too many monsters to go over except the outsiders and the old ones. If you've ever played Call of Cthulhu, it's that. If you don't know what Call of Cthulhu is, first of all, play it, and secondly, imagine Lovecraftian horrors, outer beings that are so horrible to think of and see that the very sight or mention of them causes madness. The last bit of setting information that the book gives you is on the current situation in the Dresden Files. You can skip this over entirely if your story has nothing to do with the story on the shelf behind me. So, for those of you that are interested, the Dresden Files was written at a time when the White Court of Wizards is at war with the courts of vampires. That's pretty much it. It also describes how the 2 different courts of fairies are at each other's throats, as always. It talks about how some necromancers made a play for power a few years ago and how they were shut down. It talks about some Judeo-Christian conflicts that are going on, such as between the Knights of the Cross and the Order of the Blackened Denarius. And, well, also, the last bit of information here that you don't need to know about is that a vanilla mortal is now a part of the Unseelie Accords. Also complicated setting stuff that you don't need to know about. It's like the Geneva Convention, but for supernaturals. So that's it. All of that is contained in the 5 pages of setting in the beginning of the Dresden Files core rulebook, your story found on page 10 and going onwards. My closing thoughts here, as I said in the beginning and several times throughout, you do not need to know the setting to play the game. It just gives you a little bit of a framework to work with. The Dresden Files RPG is powered by Fate, which means you can use it for literally anything. In fact, I'm working on a Wild West Dresden Files game right now. So, why not try out just a little bit of magic?